Hello, I am Lisa May Young and welcome to Scottish Ancestral Records. I'm here with Ken Nisbet of the Scottish Genealogy Society. How are you, Ken?
Oh, I'm fine. In this muggy, hot weather that we seem to be suffering at the moment, I always speak to a friend last night who lives in London, 6 days of 35 degrees plus.
Oh, it's something else, isn't it?
Absolutely miserable. So much as we would love to get back to the archives, for example, National Archives at Kew, I don't think I would want to be sitting in an archive with no air conditioning whatsoever.
Oh, I think it would be quite uncomfortable.
It would be fairly miserable. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a variety of subjects. Start with what we call, generally is referred to as wills and inventory. Now, strictly speaking, wills are what we call testaments. Well, if you think if you don't have a will when you die, you don't say, well, somebody's not got a will. You die intestate. In other words, testament, which comes from the Latin for witness.
Mm-hmm.
So a testament it's basically a witness, because as you know with a will, you have to have two witnesses. Normally, of course, people who are not actually going to inherit any estate, either movable estate or the non-movable estate. And certainly, really up until the 1960s, what wills are concerned with, or testaments, are concerned with what we call the movable goods. And movable goods can be the money in the bank, stocks and shares. You could say, go to the bank and say, give me a pile of 100,000 banknotes.
Yeah.
Not that you would carry them around, or it could be the goods in the house. It could be if you were a farmer, it could be the cattle and the sheep.
Yeah, I was thinking livestock.
Yeah, so livestock, and I'll certainly mention some farmers' wills. But it could be pictures on a wall. I was looking at a will for one of my relatives recently who died in England, and she says who she's leaving the statue of the Greek slave to. And she also talks about leaving pictures of ancestors, various relatives. Now, in Scotland, we're fortunate that up to 1926, you can get digital copies and download them for a fee on the Scotland's People website, scotlandspeople.gov website. You can download them on there. You can look at the catalogue free of charge, and that's all the wills. Now, these wills can go back to the 1500s, far predating statutory registration by a good few hundred years, if you think statutory registration starts in 1855. And at least some of the early wills can be quite difficult to read. Some might be in Latin, not that many, but they might be written in Scots, and sometimes the writing is not very easy to read. Then it's worth going on paleography classes, which I don't think there's anything run at the moment, but certainly sometimes you'll find, for example, our own society has had people coming from National Archives to run paleography classes and reading old handwriting and being able to decipher. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I met with one of my early wills. I have a will about 1600 from Stitchell and Hume on the border for one of my earliest ancestors that I know of. And trying to decipher it, it took, I think, 3 of us to try and figure out exactly what this person was referring to. Now, why are they important? Well, usually with a will, in the majority of cases, the individual who's died is going to say who's going to get the goods, mm-hmm. or who's not going to get the goods if they don't like their children, or perhaps their son-in-law. So generally speaking, most people, and even today, when they write a will, you say, well, who's going to get what? If you want to call it the boring will, can be the will that my great-grandfather wrote in 1919, who says, I'm giving everything to my wife.
That was that.
I know everything about his wife because she's my great-grandmother.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting in that respect. It refers to war bonds that he bought during the First World War. Mm-hmm. And also it makes reference to shares that he had from a South African gold mine or a company that was doing gold mining in South Africa. I haven't yet. They certainly didn't come down to us. So some wells can be, in effect, yes, but it sometimes might be useful. It's still useful to look at them because obviously you see the value of the estate that they had, confirms an address, and it will confirm the wife's name. Now, other wills, for example, I have a farmer who died near Elgin in 1837. So he's died prior to statutory registration. But he names all his children and he names the husbands of the daughter.
Brilliant information.
Yes, so you're getting information that some of these names, these children were not baptized in the Church of Scotland. So you're getting names that would not necessarily appear in church records. And the fact that they name the spouses of the daughters enables you to confirm relationships. In my case, it confirms because it names my Seaton's great grandmother and her husband. It says she, Janet Geddes, wife of William Rennie Carpenter in Avalon. In another will in St Ninians in Stirlingshire around the same period, again we have a similar situation, and again it says Janet McGrory, Janet Gillespie, wife of Alexander McGrory, servant to. And then it says that another brother-in-law is also a servant to the same individual. So you're getting family groupings.
And employment.
And employment. With another will in there to somebody who didn't have any children, his children had died in infancy, he leaves the money to his nieces and nephews. So you get a whole lot, you get intergenerational information, either perhaps backing up research again in parish registers or in statutory records, but it's providing all that information. Now, I mean, I did the same with an English will, which they talk about probate in England and Wales. And again, if you go onto the National Probate site for England and Wales, you can, in fact, they're even cheaper than Scotland because you can download them for £150. So in a way, England, and you can also, in fact, actually go, certainly up to the 1980s for England and Wales, you can actually, if something's gone to probate, I'll explain slightly where to get an English one slightly later on. But again, what I would stress is the fact that they give you this intergenerational information. They'll say perhaps why, for example, with the will in St. Ninians, he says, I'm not giving money to all these children because they've already had money. Wow. They've already been given money, perhaps when the daughter's married or the son set. But I'm leaving money to my two sons who stayed on the farm with me. So in other words, and there's another one where the one in Elgin where he says, I assume that you will continue to look after your mother in the manner to which she has become accustomed. Now his wife is in her 80s by then, so he's basically saying, look after your mom. So the fuel of its human interest, as well as necessarily who's getting the cash.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a real story, the family dynamics, isn't it?
Well, it is, because particularly when they might make rude comments about their son-in-law, the son-in-law's not being trustworthy. And quite often you will see in Wales that it will state that the daughter gets the money on the condition that it stays with her, even because you can remember under the Married Women's Act until the 1980s, if you got married and you were a woman and you had anything, that went to your husband. Mm-hmm. And the same if your father, and he writes in the will that the money's to stay with the daughter. In other words, the daughter's inheritance is not to pay for the husband's debts. Mm-hmm. So you get the word, my son-in-law is useless, is worthless. So you can, or you get children criticised almost sometimes, saying, he's a wastrel. He hasn't. I haven't got any of those, but I have seen them. I haven't got them in my family, but I've certainly seen examples where they're basically excommunicating the son because he's a rogue. Usually it's the boys, it has to be said, rather than the girls. Now, equally, that goes along with what we call testaments, is for people who died intestate, you might think, well, what is there to look at? Well, there can be what we call the inventory. And that, in effect, is a list and the valuation of the...
So they had to their name, essentially.
Yeah, but these can be very interesting. I have this for one of my ancestors who died in Cawdor. And he dies in 1878. His wife is deceased and he has two fairly young children. There's no will, but there is an inventory. So it says the valuation of his tools, who owes him money, in other words, his debts. So it's very useful. But you can also get inventories for people who do leave wills. I have a butcher relative who was a butcher in Elgin, and he dies in 1860. And the will, he leaves money to various relatives, but the inventory is huge because he was a butcher, it lists all the people that would owe him money in the town of Elgin. And it's divided into those who are able to pay and will pay, those who should be able to pay, and those who are not going, he's got no chance of getting the money one. So you could, this inventory goes on. If you think you had an A4 paper,
mm-hmm.
It's 3 pages of names, as I say, of those who will pay, those who can't pay, and those who won't pay. They've got no chance.
So pretty much it's as an advice note to his family about the amount of effort they should put in each person.
Yes. So so in an event, and of course these wills are formal because they're drawn up by lawyers. Somebody's gone because it has to be proved in the various commissary courts that we have in Scotland, because that's how it was. They were. You find if you look at the court, the records, they're into the court records, the commissaries. So. But as I say, they can be very useful in a social history point of view because, as well as a family history point of view, yes, in Scotland, you could be as poor as a church mouse, as Burns would say, but you could still have a will.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people think, it only had to be people with lots of money that have wills. But I mean, you get farmers, you get carpenters, you even get farm labourers. It's always worth looking. And as I say, don't just look at the direct ancestors. If you've got an unmarried aunt or an unmarried uncle, and they're a farmer or anything, have a look at these wills because they might mention the nieces and the nephews. And it confirms the picture together. And it also might enable you to get back because they might say, oh, he's my niece or he's my nephew. That confirms. So it ties things up together. Now, when it came to inheritance of land, very much, as most people will know, that if it was an eldest son, he would get the land. He would get the land. Most people didn't actually own the property. Either the property they lived in was a lot more. It's really the 20th century is when we see house owning coming in. And if you think of farms, even more so, it was post-First World War when we get death duties attached to a lot of the big estates, is when you start seeing farmers actually buying their land. I mean, for example, if you take Brodie of Lethen Estate in Nairnshire, pre-First World War, you were talking 40,000 acres. Post-First World War, it's down to about 20,000 because the estate, because Ewan Brodie gets killed at 1st April 1914, there's big death duties they have to sell. And that's when you get farmers beginning to buy land. And particularly, I mean, it's different in Nairnshire now, Lord Codder still owns most of Codder Parish, but the surrounding parishes, owner-occupied farms. In the 19th century, so in Wales, what you might get is reference to keeping the lease, keeping the tenancy.
Right, okay, I wondered that, yeah.
For example, the farmer in Stirlingshire in the parish of St Ninians, when he dies, when John Gillespie dies, it makes reference to the lease going to one of his sons with the local landowner. Some landowners would say, oh, take the opportunity to remove the family from the farm, so they wouldn't always. But the landowners now in Scotland, when land is purchased, nowadays we take a mortgage, but you'll know that in effect you get the property, you get the property deed, and in effect these are what we call sazines. Now the sazines are not on that. The sazines are held at the National Records of Scotland. They're not yet online. It would be great if they were, but they're not yet online. And in effect, if you look at the sazine, it's in effect, it says who your relative borrowed the money from to buy the house. And then if you see them taking out more rent, borrowing more money, that's perhaps certainly with a couple of my relatives in the Lithgow who later went bankrupt. So they kept on borrowing money. Having bought the house, they then borrow more money against the property, just as you might do nowadays. I mean, it's kind of circumstances. For example, some people might be saying, oh, I've got a problem. I might be made redundant, so I'm going to take a loan out against it. Not always a good, sensible thing to do. But these records do exist, and Scotland's very fortunate in that we have information on the deeds on the sazines at National Records of Scotland. And we do have, there are a couple of CDs that the SGS has produced on Testament of Deeds, which are for the 16th, 17th and 18th century, again to do with property. So they're worth looking at. As I say, look at the Scottish People website for the actual wills and inventories.
Yeah, because if you follow the trail of property as opposed to people, that's quite interesting in itself, isn't it?
Oh yes, I mean that in effect is one way of if you were doing a history of a village or a history of a house. That's one way, because obviously that's where you see the money used to purchase a house. Now, there are also on the Scotland People website, as some people will know, you have the valuation rolls. Now, the valuation rolls on the Scotland People website go up to 1940. So if you think of it, they're one of the few things on the website where you've actually got a list of individuals halfway through the 20th century. Now, the valuation rolls, in themselves, they're not going to give you a family history because they don't say, oh, these are a list of all the people living in the house. What they do tell us is they tell us who owned the property, who the tenants are. In some cases, the subtenants are during the 19th century. It might give you some of the subtenants. Quite often, it will give you the occupation. So, for example, I can see my grandfather moving from Greenock to Aberdeen in the 1930s. He initially has a council house, and then he buys his own house in 1933 in Aberdeen. Now, I then go on to Find My Past, look at the newspapers, and I can get a picture and advert for the house that my father was born in. And I think it cost £450 in Hilton in Aberdeen. You would not definitely pay £450 for a house in Aberdeen, no matter how far the oil price drops. Very interesting. And of course, that leads you do look, as I previously said, always do look at the National Library of Scotland's map collection, free to use, utterly brilliant, and always, in effect, I would recommend getting their newsletter. Where, for example, last weekend they put up some fire insurance map for City of Dundee, Aberdeen, not Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, bits of Leith, and Glasgow. And they're fascinating to look at because it actually shows you company names, and it also shows you what kind of business was actually occupied. So, for example, we can look at Victoria Terrace with the STSs and see that a leather merchants that was actually occupying the site where the STS currently has the library. So, and they're constantly putting on new types of maps on, but you can, for normal places, you can get up to 25 inch to the mile. Mm-hmm. So they're worth looking at. Another great website that ties in with that is to look at the Scotland's Places. Scotlandplaces.gov.uk. I've previously spoken about them. Look at the Ordnance Survey place name set. That quite often will give you a brief description of the property, particularly farms. And with farms, if you look at a statutory record, it might simply say Broomhill Codder. And you think, well, what is Broomhill Codder? So you stick Broomhill Codder into the Ordnance Survey place names, or even in Google, Scotland's Places, Broomhill Codder, it will take you straight to the page instead of you actually having to go through that website, searching it. But do have it, because that will quite often give you a brief description. It will usually tell you possibly where the names come from or why they think a place has got a name, but quite often it will give you a brief description, possibly who's occupying the farm when the survey was taking place. But it's very useful, and as you tie that with the map, and that, as I say, also look at the newspapers on Find My Past, and yes, don't fill out the subject, the name line, just put the farm name. So, for example, I was Codder, and see what comes up, because quite often you will then get references to ploughing matches, if there was anything unusual happened on the farm, clearing any reports, for example, when farmers change tenancies. Because I was doing an article for the Historic Scotland magazine, which will be coming out fairly soon, and I made reference in that to looking at a farm, and it said John Wilson is giving up this farm. So in effect, you can see when somebody's retiring or moving on, and then you might get a report on who the incoming tenant is. So it's building up this picture.
Yeah, I mean, I did history of my flat, which I found really fascinating, and the most interesting thing about it was there was in the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s, the owner was a spinster from Coultney Weems. And I don't know if she'd inherited it from dad or husband or whatever it was, but she was a tenant, and she was the owner and had 3 male tenants. And one of the tenants in particular was paid less rent than the other ones. Yeah, so but you know, very unusual for a woman of that time to own property.
It was, but it was one of the ways of getting money, particularly single women. One of my relatives had a temperance hotel in Nicholson Street in Edinburgh. She was married to a German, and he died in the 1890s, so well before the First World War. But she kept on the hotel and ran it with her sister, who never married. And we can see this from the census and also from her will, her running business on her own. So while it's undoubtedly true to say that women's liberation, if you want to call it in the certain brackets, really starts after women getting the vote in 1919, widowed women in particular did run their own businesses. Once the husband dies, yes, in many cases they would run out, and it has to be brutally said, they look for the nearest man that had money, particularly if they have young children.
Yeah.
Get remarried as quick as possible.
Yeah.
But if they were later on in their life and their children have departed, they've got one option. They've got to either earn money on their own or they're going to end up in workhouse or poorhouse in Scotland.
And in the cases of men, if their wife had died, they would marry for childcare.
Very quickly. I have that in my own family history. 2 cases that descended from the second wife, because the first wife has died. The husband has, in one case, 1 young child, and in another case, 2 young children. But the second one, he kind of dumps them on the grandparents and then remarries. The first one, his son is brought up with his new wife and their children from that second marriage. Whereas with the first one, he kind of, he runs off and marries somebody else, but dumps the 2 children from the first marriage with the grandparents of his first wife. So that sometimes when you look at a census and you see grandchildren, it's possibly staying with their grandparents, it's possibly an indication that there has been a marriage and that there's been some kind of family argument or breakup or something like that. So the children get dumped with the grandparents. Or possibly both parents have died. I mean, as you know, puerperal fever was a big killer of women in childbirth. Men, industrial accidents, any numerous of the 19th century killers could lead to a situation where you have children with their grandparents. Obviously, adoption in Scotland does become formalised till the 1929, 1930 with the Scottish Adoption Act. Prior to that, adoption doesn't always appear on statutory. I mean, there's no adoption register. Certainly, obviously, Forest Home and Bernardo's might have some records. But
some were informal, weren't they?
A lot of them were informal, and that's where you don't actually spot the 1911 census where it says adopted, because then, of course, that's where a lot of people started saying, oh, he's an adopted child. Where in the 1901 census, they might simply have put son or daughter. I certainly have that with one example. And I was trying to figure it out, and I just couldn't find the child's birth record to go with parents' marriage, and then figured out, oh, hang on, it's subsequent. And then 1911 census says it's an adopted child. I mean, childless couples adopting children. Sometimes they would come from another family member, or sometimes, if you have 12 kids and you're not earning much money, you might palm off a child to your childless
cousin.
But these records wouldn't, it would be informed. The only way you could do it nowadays, obviously, is with DNA. DNA might be able to prove that there's no the blood linkage or the blood lines don't actually match up with. But accuracy of DNA, even the DNA companies will tell you that anything under 8 centimetre, 8 cm, as they say, it's not always a bit reliable. I mean, DNA doesn't do your family history for you. It's very interesting. Ancestry one is probably the best one to use. I'm going to be biased. I don't work for Ancestry, everybody knows that, but they're probably the best one for actually making connections with other relatives.
Yeah, I got my results back.
Yes, I know you should.
I know. I thought it was brilliant. I don't know where the France and Germany stuff comes from, but I might find it through time. But like you say, it's a very, very small percentage. So
yes, and that's something I was saying to my students when I was teaching the other day was be careful with some of the geographical areas they name. For example, if you look at Find My Past, they give me 24% Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland, but southwest Scotland actually stretches into the Lowlands.
Yes.
And I know for a fact that I don't have many relatives in southwest Scotland, or certainly not Northern Ireland. I do have a lot from the Lothian. The one from Lincolnshire and Northumberland, I know those are my dad's side. The Highlanders, no problem, that's my mum's side.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, apart from the France and Germany, nothing that came up for me was a surprise. Because I was able to, in the past ancestry that I've done, I was able to, right, that's that. But it was quite nice confirming, like it confirmed the Black Isle for me, and it confirmed Clan Young being in the south of Scotland, and it confirmed Ferry Den, so...
Oh yes, well, according to, I have mine with a couple of companies, and certainly with your family tree, it says I'm 100% British. Which is what I thought. Yes, when they start speculating about your ancestors possibly having come in from the Middle East and then wandered around Europe 20,000 years, but I'm never going to get any names 20,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting, possibly in a scientific, but what most of us are interested in is the maybe 300 or 400 years. Because we have to be honest, we're not going, you might get all your 3 or your 4 times great-grandparents and possibly 3/4 of your 5 times. But there are going to be gaps. You're not going to get any further. I said that when it was first started. You've got to accept. So that's when you move on to looking at these things, as you said, starting off by looking at wills, testaments, looking at all the things that help us to build up our family. Do you always look? Now, you may not subscribe to the commercial websites, but do look and see what's coming on new. Even if you don't see, that's a new set of data records. Do have a look at them. Also have a look at Family Search, which is the Church of Latter-day Saints family history site. Now, it's a
brilliant site.
Yes, you don't have to be a Mormon to use it. You have to register to use it now. But, for example, one of the things that's come on them recently is a lot of South African records, both statutory records and also wills and testaments. And it's free to use. And you can download the document. Once you've looked at it, you can then save it in your family history folder. So it can be read. It's always worth keeping an eye on what new stuff is coming out.
And you can sign up for the newsletters for free, can't you? So you're not under any obligation.
Yeah. Always sign up. For example, as I've already said this evening, I use the National Library of Scotland's newsletter. Yeah. That's free to sign up for. It tells you about any exhibitions. In fact, they're just looking at reopening the library, or admittedly with appointments only. But as I say, the free digital collections that they've got online, the map ones constantly expanding. It's always worth looking. I do a lot of walking, as you know, and if I walk up along one of these old railways, I immediately go and look on the maps on the survey 25 inch mile, and I look, there used to be a coal mine over there. I might go and look at the coal mining website, the Scottish Mining Museum's website. It's very good. There's also one for shale mining in Scotland. Yes, and that's worth looking for because, for example, with the coal mining one, particularly for your listeners in Fife, it very usefully lists all the pits in Fife, and it also lists a lot of the accidents. So if someone died down the pit, and you found it will make a reference to perhaps where the newspaper, where the article would be in the newspaper. I mean, if you think, I don't think even there's any open cast mining, coal mining in Scotland anymore, but certainly there's no underground mining. And obviously, if you've got ancestors from Fife, the Lothians, although the Lothians is both shale and coal mining, whereas Fife is very much coal mining. Yeah. But people went from I've got relatives, not ancestors, who moved from the Lothians to Fife, from shale mining to becoming coal mining.
But yeah, I had my dad's side of the family. They were also miners. Yeah, in Lothian. You followed where the work was, didn't you? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because as
Yeah.
the mine played out, they closed the mine. That's all. And the fascinating thing, I think, with the OS maps is you will see a little row of cottages. And if you compare that with the modern picture of the landscape with the aerial photograph, and you can do that on the NLS website, there's no cottages there anymore. Cottages have been demolished. Again, you look at the Scotland's Places website, have a look at that. That again will perhaps say, oh, there was miners' cottages here. Now, that, of course, can then lead you on, if you're getting onto industries, is do look at the government reports on the National Library of Scotland, the digital collection. If you sign up for that with the digital reader's ticket, you can then go on to what they call the blue books, or the reports, so that on working commissions. So, for example, you might not get reference to an individual. You sometimes do, with, for example, the Poor Law Report reforms in the 1840s in Scotland, or occasionally party commissions. It might say, oh, they interviewed so and so. But the great thing you might find is the details of the working conditions down the mine.
Children, yeah.
They were employing women down, carrying big creels in the back, heavy weights, 100-weight coal sometimes in some cases, up and down these very rickety ladders, and children. And you get the reform. You also get reports on the state of the schooling in the parishes and how that changed. Was it free schooling? Was the school teacher getting paid in kind, in effect, boils, what they call bags of porridge oats?
Yeah.
When my mother went to university in Aberdeen, she actually got a big bag of oats to take with her from my mum. I mean, and that's in the 1950s. My grandparents not having much money. But you will get these reports, and they get, again, they're free to look at. A lot of free resources out there that you or we as family historians should make much more of. Because as I've always said, family history is not just names, dates, and places. It's great fun to put out the little crossword and put all your names and dates and places in. And then say, oh, I've got to fill out the blank spot. But you want to expand the blank spot and say, well, what were these individuals? What did they do? That's what family history is. It's more than just names.
It's people, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think that's why. Yeah, if you watch Who Do You Think You Are, or the David's program about the history of the house, it's not just a family history; it's a social history. But particularly, I mean, you'll see that Find My Path doesn't always make an effort to get back, perhaps terribly far. It might be purely to the Second World War, because it's the stories. Stories are terribly important. Write down the stories. Check the stories out. They can be true. Sometimes they'll be exaggerated. But look out for more stuff coming on Second World War. I think there is a recognition that more and more people want access to Second World War service papers. You look, if you get in with yourself with the RAF, the genealogist website, again, one of the commercial sites, has a lot of aerial combat reports. Some of them you can get from the National Archives. And while we're talking about UK National Archives, remember you can still download stuff free of the UK National Archives. It's £3.50. So if you're looking for all those war diaries, download the war diaries for the First World War.
That's where to go.
That's where to go. They've got nurses' records for the First World War. They've got the front page of the medal card for First World War, but I would always say look at the Ancestry. It's got both sides. But and the other thing at the moment is look for webinars and WebExes. I mean, I'm obviously, as people will know, I'm very much into the First World War. The Western Front Association, of which I'm a branch chairman, is running weekly free talks, Zoom talks. If you go onto the Western Front Association website, you will see details of the talks, and I'll also put them on Facebook. So again, you get free talks on a huge variety of subjects, not just battles. It has to be said. It can be. Last Monday's was on the Zeebrugge raid, but we've had on the relationships of French, British, and American troops, and how they all fell out after the First World War. But variety. Highland Archives have been running classes. I know that Crony in Northern Ireland, again, has been running. Always have a look. You just, of course, there's online family history courses, classes like lifelong learning in Dundee. I'm going to hold my hand up and say that's a selling point because it's me that's teaching it. So there's an actual inclination. Some of these, yes, there's a charge to attend them, but I'm going to say my one's good. I'm biased.
Well, if you could share the links with us, Ken, I'd be happy to share that in the podcast. So that would make it easier for our listeners to just click on there.
Yes, I mean, we can do that. Now, obviously, we're going to have a little break.
Yes, yeah. Lisa's needing a wee sabbatical, a very brief sabbatical. So we're going to be back beginning of November.
Well, November, of course, is particularly apt because I'm immediately going to say the 11th of November, of course, is Armistice. So, and of course, if we're talking 1919, don't forget that there were at least 2 Scottish battalions still in Russia. And that's partly why the Commonwealth War graves at Headstones go up to beyond 1918, because, of course, our troops are sent up to Archangel. Canadian troops went to Siberia. You don't know what. Canadians were set off. They didn't actually do much in Siberia, but certainly the Royal Scots got involved in quite serious fighting up near Archangel in 1919, 1920. The podcast will continue. Do not fear. We're not going anywhere. But we might even be a bit more out of lockdown by then.
Yes.
One can but hope.
Yes, if not, we'll just need to keep on relying on the trusty Zoom, Ken. But that's right. But we're looking forward to seeing you again at the beginning of November. Thank you very much, Ken.